Okay, just getting ready here. How's everybody doing?
We're good.
All right. Let's see here. So can everybody see where it says the word Chanukah?
Yeah, it's on the screen.
All right. Very good. So let's get started. 1 second, 7:45. Yeah, okay. So tonight's class is about Chanukah. Tonight's the last night of Chanukah. So we're going to study something and derive whatever lesson and inspiration we can from it. Now, the way this class is going to work is, as is common when studying many things within Judaism. So the Torah has a body and a soul. The body are the practices and observances of Judaism. The soul is the spirit and the reasoning behind it. So sometimes we don't know enough about the spirit and we don't know enough about the soul, but the way to learn about it is by studying the body, the observances and the practices, and that they're related, not only very closely related, they're perfectly and harmoniously two opposite sides of the same coin. The body and the soul of Torah, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So today we're going to study an anomaly, a discrepancy, so to speak, in the observance of Hanukkah, something different, a question that we have about the observance of Hanukkah, which will shed light also on the spirit behind Hanukkah as well. So let's get into it. Hanukkah, is there anything that we don't yet know? So let's just do a quick overview of the Jewish holidays. What are the Jewish holidays in general? Sukkot, God protected us in the desert with huts. According to various interpretations, that means also the clouds of glory that surrounded the Jewish people when they were in the desert. Okay, what's Pesach? We were freed from slavery. What's Shavuot? God gave us the Torah. What's Purim? We were saved from annihilation. What's Hanukkah? We were saved from spiritual persecution, religious tyranny. This is a quick overview of the Jewish holidays. Now, if you wanted to boil down and if you wanted to reduce, if you wanted to crystallize and capture all of the Jewish holidays into one sentence, or maybe it's 3 short sentences, there's the famous Jewish joke, which is very relevant to tonight's class. But let's read it inside. How do we celebrate? They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. This is a classic quote, and if anyone knows the original source, feel free to share. I think
yes, the Bourse Circuit, 1928, probably. Maybe it was Henny Youngman.
Okay. All right. Very good. We've got our trivia masters here. Thank you. And so basically, in short, we find this theme by every Jewish holiday. Everyone's familiar. There's food all over the place. We just feel relieved and excited and thankful and grateful that we survived something. And we just pile on the food we eat, whether it's matzah or the whole Seder, all the Seder foods, or Rosh Hashanah. We have all sorts of dishes that are sweet. And each holiday has its own thing that we eat. And we definitely like to pile it on. Okay, so very simple. What does this have to do with Hanukkah? Let's move on. Hanukkah is different. That's what we're going to explore tonight. That if we look at all of the Jewish holidays, there's something different about Hanukkah that stands out. And so let's take a closer look at that. So other holidays, let's see if we can get a little spotlight here. There we go. See that little red light over there? So like a pointer. So other holidays, for example, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, Purim, Pesach, Shavuot, Shabbat, all of those holidays share a certain obligation in the code of Jewish law. And the obligation that they share is that there's an obligation to eat a meal, which, as a side note, typically includes bread. A meal in this context always means bread as a base, always has a drink, there's water, there could be meat on the holidays. It says we have to have joy on the holidays. Joy is understood classically to refer to meat, although if a person specifically doesn't have joy with meat, they can have joy in other ways. And then wine is an important part of all holidays as well. Also, joy refers to wine. And Shabbat, we have Kiddush. Yom holidays, we have Kiddush. So we have these different food elements which we're obligated to eat. Yes, there's exceptions, but generally speaking, obligated to eat by all of the holidays. What about Chanukah? So Chanukah, there's no obligation to eat a meal. That may come as a surprise because on Chanukah we're familiar with, there's actually two food items that are very, very popular, and they're actually related. So one of them is latkes, potato pancakes. That's the Ashkenazic traditional dish. And then donuts or sufganiyot is the Sephardic traditional dish. And both of them are related because they both connect to oil. They're both either potato pancakes fried in oil, donuts fried in oil. They both come back to the same place. Hanukkah is about oil. But those are not, there's no obligation to eat any meal, any festive meal on Hanukkah. So let's read that inside, or maybe someone can volunteer to read this little line and a half. Maybe Reb Shmuel, if you could read this little line and a half.
These many meals which we add on these days are voluntary. Our sages did not establish them as days of feasting and joy.
Okay, thank you, Reb Shmuel. So the Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Code of Jewish Law, says unequivocally that the many meals which we have on Hanukkah are voluntary meals, but there's no obligation to have a feasting and joy. Now, you'll notice there, we're not going to read it now, but there is an additional note. It says the Ramah. That's the person who made notes on the Code of Jewish Law and amended it for the Ashkenazic community, the Ramah. And he says, although there's no obligation, there's a bit of a mitzvah, and he goes off on that tangent, but he agrees to the main point, central point, that there's no obligation to eat a meal. So that's what we're left with right now, is that all other holidays, there's an obligation to eat a physical meal, and Hanukkah, there's no obligation to eat a physical meal. So that anomaly, or that fact that exists in the observance of Hanukkah, draws our attention to something about Hanukkah. So the question is why? What is it about Hanukkah that we celebrate it with Thanksgiving and praising Hashem and lighting candles, but we don't celebrate it? There's no obligation to have a meal. So there's actually a very simple hypothesis, which we're going to check out right now. Very simple hypothesis that has been suggested to explain why all the other holidays we have physical food, but Hanukkah there's no obligation to have physical food. And the hypothesis is that physical salvation, when we're saved from something physical, like by Pesach, our bodies were slaves in Egypt. There was harsh labor, backbreaking work, etc., etc. We were saved from physical slavery. Also Purim, for example. We were under threat of annihilation. All of the Jewish people, men, women, and children in a single day were under threat of annihilation. We were saved from that incredible decree. So the hypothesis here goes that for a physical salvation, you eat physical food to commemorate it. But for spiritual salvation, such as Hanukkah, on Hanukkah, there was no threat to the Jewish body on its own. The entire threat of Hanukkah was a spiritual one. There was a religious persecution. The rulers of the Greek rulers of the Jewish people, they were under the Syrian province of the Greek Empire at the time. They made a decree that the Jewish people are not allowed to do certain religious practices. So it was a spiritual war, and that's what the Maccabees revolted against as well. They said, we're not going to let this go. We're going to fight for our spiritual and religious freedoms. And they fought for that, and they won. Miraculously, the few against the many, the weak against the mighty. Incredible. It was a physical war, a bloody war. If you read the historical accounts in the various books, Book of Maccabees, etc., very gory descriptions. There were war elephants that the Greeks had, and they put spears into them, and all sorts of gory, physical, bloody stories in these wars. But the point, the goal of the entire story of Hanukkah was a spiritual one. That there was a religious persecution, and the Jews wanted to be freed from that religious persecution. If they would have said, you know what? We're going to do what you guys want. We're going to give up our religious rights. We're not going to keep those certain laws of the Torah anymore that you don't want us to keep. The Greeks would have had no issue. They would have said, beautiful, that's fantastic. We have no personal issue against you. It's just those certain laws that we don't want you to keep. So again, it was a religious persecution, a spiritual persecution, spiritual salvation, and therefore we don't commemorate it with physical food, but by lighting candles and by Thanksgiving. So that's the standard hypothesis, which is offered by the commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law, the Bach, the Taz, the Lavush, etc., from the famous commentators on the Code of Jewish Law. The Rebbe asks here a question, however. He decides to dig a little bit deeper to see if this hypothesis holds true under further scrutiny. So he starts off with point number one as follows. He says, first of all, is it really true that first of all, you have to understand, he brings out 2 points. Number one, even the physical foods that Jewish people eat are not just physical, they're also spiritual to them. And then he makes his second point, which we'll see in the next slide, which is that even physical salvations of the Jewish people also have spiritual significance. So it's not so simple and clear cut just to say that, oh, Purim and Pesach are physical salvation, physical food. There's a lot more spirituality to these holidays and spiritual meaning to those foods as well, as we're going to go on to demonstrate. So let's just start with this slide here. Even the physical foods of the Jewish people are spiritual. Number one, we find that bread is compared to Torah. It's in the Tanakh, it's in Proverbs 9:5. We find that water is compared to Torah in multiple places. Actually, I don't even have all the sources here, but it goes back to one of the prophets said, behold, anyone who is thirsty, drink water. And he was referring to Torah. But also we have this citation from the Talmud, Bava Kama 17a. We also have another story in the Talmud with Rabbi Akiva during the time of Roman persecution against religious persecution, that they outlawed the study of Torah, and Rabbi Akiva studied Torah anyways under the risk of death to himself. And he was asked, why are you teaching Torah if you're possibly going to die? And he said, we're just like fish in the water. The Torah is our water, and we're fish. We need to live and immerse ourselves in the Torah in order to survive. If we go out of the water, out of the Torah, we can't survive. So again, Rabbi Akiva here compared water to Torah. So what does this all mean? This means that Jewish people, not just unique, let's say you want to explain to someone what Torah is, right? So you don't just take a unique animal or a strange food and compare that to Torah. You don't say, well, a peacock reminds me of Torah, or an ostrich reminds me of Torah, or a sushi reminds me of Torah. Jewish people don't just take exotic foods or items and say that reminds me of Torah. It's the simplest of foods simplest of things that remind Jewish people of Torah. Bread reminds them of Torah. Water reminds them of Torah. So the Rebbe is just bringing out this point here that you can't just say that just because we eat physical food on Purim and Pesach means it's all about the physical. There's a lot more.
I don't know if you can hear me or not, but you're muted.
Okay, we are back. Where did we leave off, Reb Shmuel?
We were talking about water.
Water, okay. So, about Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah.
Okay. So at any rate, what we're saying here is that even the physical foods of the Jewish people are spiritual. Bread is spiritual. Water is spiritual. When we look at them, we see Torah. And eating on Shabbat and Yom Tov is a mitzvah. So what does this bring out? This brings out that physical foods to us also have spiritual significance. And therefore, it's not so simple to say that just because that the only reason why Chanukah has no physical obligation to eat food is just because it's a spiritual salvation. Because physical food to us is not just physical, it's also spiritual as well. Let's move on to the next slide. Even the physical, we're trying to say that even the physical salvation of the Jewish people is also spiritual. So again, we introduce in this class a question. The question is about an anomaly, a discrepancy between the other holidays and Hanukkah. Other holidays, there's an obligation to eat a festive meal. Hanukkah, there's no obligation to eat a festive meal. Our question was, why is that the case? So we presented a hypothesis that all the other holidays have to do with a physical salvation, so we eat physical food. But Hanukkah is a spiritual salvation, so we do not have an obligation to eat physical food. So the Rebbe is examining this hypothesis, putting it under scrutiny to see if it holds true. So he asks a question here, one second. The other holidays have very strong spiritual elements as well. So the first one we're going to talk about is Pesach. Yes, it's true that on Pesach we were freed from slavery, but is that all that Pesach was about? So maybe if someone else could read here, maybe Dave, are you able to do your microphone? Read something for us on the mic? If not, actually you wrote something in the, or you could read for us this little Pesach paragraph perhaps. And Dave, are you able to read? Oh, in the chat. Okay, Dave is, no, we can't. Okay, fine. So let's go to Shmuel. Shmuel, if you could read that for us.
All right. And he said, for I will be with, are you talking about over here with the red?
Yeah.
And he said, for I will be with you, and this is a sign for you that it was I who sent you. When you take the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain.
So this is a verse that God told Moshe that when you take the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So what the Rebbe is trying to bring out by quoting this verse, this is in Exodus and Shemot, is that the freedom from slavery on Pesach is inherently linked with receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. So it doesn't hold under scrutiny to say that Pesach, Passover, is simply a physical salvation and nothing else. It's just being freed from slavery. That's not the whole story. It's also a spiritual, part of a spiritual journey, part of going from people who don't have the Torah to do have the Torah. So that's just Pesach. Let's go on to Purim. I'll read this one. How is Purim spiritual? Seemingly it's just being saved from annihilation, from genocide. So Purim, after being saved from annihilation, the Jews accepted upon themselves willingly to fulfill the Torah. This is from the Talmud in Shabbat 88a. So let's read this. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chassa said, the Jewish people actually stood, we're talking now about the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, that the Jewish people were forced to keep the Torah, but that by Purim, about many years later, they accepted the Torah by their own free choice. I'm going to read this inside where the red light, where the red dot is. So Rabbi Avdimi said that the Jewish people stood beneath the mountain, that's Mount Sinai, and the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub, and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. If not, there will be your burial. So this is a Talmudic teaching which seems to indicate that by the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Jews were forced to accept the Torah under threat of death. Says Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, from here, there's a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding. So Rava said, even so, they again accepted it in the time of Achashverosh. In English, they write it Ahasuerus, as that's the king of Persia in the story of Purim. As it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. And he taught, this is Rava taught, the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai. This is a Talmudic teaching that the Jewish people, although at Mount Sinai, they were forced into keeping the Torah by threat of death, nonetheless, many, many years later, by the story of Purim, when they were saved from annihilation, they then accepted upon themselves to keep the Torah by their own free choices, different interpretations of why it happened by the story of Purim, either because they were so excited and thankful by the miracle that God did to them, or because the threat of the story of Purim brought out something deeper in them that wasn't experienced by them before. Either way, let's just zoom out for a second. What are we trying to bring out on this slide? What's the Rebbe's point here? That it doesn't hold up to scrutiny to say that the other holidays, as opposed to Chanukah, that the other holidays are only about physical salvation. There are strong spiritual elements to those holidays as well. So the question remains, why is it that by Hanukkah there is no obligation to eat a festive meal, but by the other holidays there is an obligation to eat a festive meal? Again, Pesach, Purim, Sukkot, Shabbat, Purim, all the other holidays. And you can't just say that, oh, those holidays were only about the physical, so we celebrate physically. That's not true. There were very strong spiritual elements to those as well. Not talking about Shavuot, which is literally just about the giving of the Torah, etc., etc. So there must be something a little bit deeper that we can point to here about why Hanukkah has no obligation to eat a physical meal. So does that make sense? Any questions up until this point?
Well, let's see what you have in addition here, because I have some very definite views on that sort of thing.
Okay.
I'm not a scholar on this, but I have some thoughts.
Okay.
So let's see what else you got.
Okay.
Go ahead with your dialogue, and let's see what we get here.
Okay. So there's just one additional note before we go further, that we were just pointing out that the other holidays were not just physical salvation, but they were also had spiritual elements. And we also pointed out that the physical foods that Jewish people eat on those holidays have deep spiritual significance as well. When we see them, they remind us of things like the Torah, etc. So there's a lot of spirituality to those other holidays. So it doesn't hold up to scrutiny to say that, oh, Hanukkah is all spiritual, that's why we have Thanksgiving and lighting candles and no physical food that we're obligated to eat. All the holidays are spiritual. So this is just another note from the other side, that Hanukkah wasn't just spiritual either. Hanukkah had physical oppression as well. So I'm just going to read this little piece here from Maimonides in the Laws of Hanukkah. In the era of the Second Temple, the Greek kingdom issued decrees against the Jewish people, attempting to nullify their faith and refusing to allow them to observe the Torah and its commandments. They extended their hands against their property and their daughters. They entered the sanctuary, wrought havoc within, and made the sacraments impure. The Jews suffered great difficulties from them, for they oppressed them greatly until the God of our ancestors had mercy upon them, delivering them from their hand, and saved them. The son of the Asmoneans, the Hashmonaim, the high priest, overcame them, slew them, and saved the Jews from their hands. They appointed a king for the priests, and sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. Just another point to bring out, that the answer that we gave before to differentiate between Hanukkah and the other holidays, the Hanukkah spiritual and the other ones are physical, doesn't hold up to scrutiny at all. All the other ones are spiritual, and this one's also physical. So they're all spiritual and they're all physical. They're all both. So we still don't understand why the other holidays have an obligation, according to the Code of Jewish Law, to eat a festive meal, and Hanukkah has no obligation. You also can't answer that the other ones are biblical in origin. They come from the Torah itself, while Hanukkah is only rabbinic. It was later holiday enacted by the rabbis later because Purim is also rabbinic. And on Purim, the rabbis enacted that there would be a festive meal. That's one of the obligations of Purim. So we don't understand why Chanukah has no obligation to eat a physical meal. Why did the rabbis not make that a part of the observance of Chanukah, that there's an obligation to eat a festive meal?
Well, history tells us why.
Okay, what's the reason?
Well, I mean, I want to hear your reason because it's going to differ than mine.
All right. Okay. Well, okay. Happy to hear the reason that you've thought of as well, that you're familiar with. But either way, so the Rebbe really, he takes the same hypothesis as before, but he comes at it from a little bit of a deeper angle. He says that all of the holidays are spiritual, but Hanukkah is spiritual plus. And that's why the other holidays, we have regular physical foods that remind us also of spiritual ideas. But Hanukkah, it's so spiritual plus, that we don't even have any obligation to eat physical food at all. And then in a different wording than that on this slide up here in front of us, to word it slightly different. To unpack that a little bit better, what does it mean that other holidays are spiritual, but Hanukkah is spiritual plus? So to unpack that a little bit better, I'm just going to read this. The other holidays are spiritual salvation at a level that can be grasped. In other words, spiritual ideas that people have the ability to understand, to comprehend, to fully grasp. All other holidays involve spiritual ideas that can be grasped by people, but Hanukkah connects with a level of spirituality that cannot be fully grasped by people. Now, this is a very, I'll call it an opaque statement. This is a very not understood statement.
I get it.
Okay.
Well, the problem is that now we're basically, roughly 2,200 years later than Hanukkah, something like that. And because Hanukkah was roughly 150 years before the fall of the Second Temple from the Romans.
Exactly.
Somewhere around in there. I don't know exactly the years. But so now we have history. The thing is that what we start to learn, or what we know now through Jewish history, is that physical structures. Now let me first say is that I do believe that Hashem wants to reside in the Holy Temple in its space for the Hashem. It's always been that way in Mount Moriah. Hashem belongs there, wants to be there, and we might hopefully be back there at some point. So Hashem wants that. However, we know by 2,200 years later, we now can see that in spite of all the trials, what really is important is not physical structures to save Judaism. It's the spiritual aspect, not food even, not physical. Now, I want the temple to come back. I really do. But I may not want it the way they did it back then. Even. So the answer is that, and we want a place for Hashem to reside because he wants to be there. And ask anybody from the Temple Institute what they think about that.
Okay.
But the fact of the matter is, we don't need a particular physical temple with columns and marble and great stones to actually practice Judaism, and we don't need a certain kind of food. We need the spiritual element that overcomes all of that, and it's demonstrated by the fact that we do lose the we overcome the Greeks at one point, but then we don't at another point. I've read history on this, and then come the Romans, and then come everything else, and we're in the diaspora. And Judaism actually became a different religion than Temple Judaism by far. And it has nothing to do with food. I mean, so there.
Okay.
That's my thought.
I hear you. You're saying the spiritual is stronger in the final analysis than the physical.
Absolutely.
The physical was, for example, the Holy Temple, which was the center of Judaism, which stood for many, many years. But the Jewish people, have existed in 2,000 years throughout the exile. based on our spiritual ideas. So in the final analysis, spiritual is much stronger. That is true, but I would still say that doesn't fully explain why only Chanukah has no obligation to eat physical food, but the other obligations do have an obligation to eat physical food. Because Hashem, God, the creator of the world and the author of the Torah, when God made those other holidays, God knew what is the strongest force in the world. So even if spirituality is the strongest force in the world, God knew that when those other holidays were created, and nonetheless, physical foods became an important part of those holidays. So why was that the case? So within Jewish holidays itself, which all Jewish holidays are part of the Torah, all of them are sourced in God, who is intimately familiar with all of existence and knows the beginning to the end of history and knows the power of spirituality. Why are the other holidays connected with physical foods, but Hanukkah isn't? But the truth is, what you said does touch on it also, as we'll get to that momentarily.
Isn't there minhag there that that's taken place over time? The one hand, the desire for Jews to always celebrate the fact that we're linked to Hashem, that as a group of people, we're all linked to Hashem in regardless of how we celebrate this or that, because it does differ in different places. And we have the, there's all of that. And so the minhags are different. And it isn't, and of course, the Jew, well, why shouldn't we party? I mean, that's another problem. Of course, we want to party because we're celebrating the fact that we're a link to this Torah. But the fall of what the Maccabees did was show you that the Jews should have courage to overcome the diversity of the foreigners, of the golim that are eventually going to cause us problems, and have always caused us problems. And what does the food got to do with it? Because
every element of observance is precise. And especially if we observe an anomaly, a difference, where one thing is celebrated one way, and then something else is celebrated differently, it raises a question mark as to why it was happened that way. If all of the other holidays that we have, we thank Hashem by making a physical feast, and that's by all of the holidays, by Purim, but whatever they celebrate, by Pesach being saved from slavery, by Purim there was physical annihilation, genocide, Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, Shabbat, Sukkot, the divine protection that God gave us in the desert. All of those holidays, we thank God by making a physical meal. But on Hanukkah, and although Purim is also rabbinic in origin, it's also not Torah mandated, as Dave pointed out. It may still be part of the Tanakh, the end of the Tanakh, but it's not biblically mandated. And it's rabbinic in origin, but there's an obligation to make a festive meal on Hanukkah. There isn't. So that's what we're analyzing here. Why is that the case? Is there anything that might point us towards? And like we've introduced now, all the holidays are really spiritual, but Hanukkah is spiritual plus, and we're going to unpack that right now.
What the Maccabees failed to do, however, was actually the Maccabees themselves, the whole tribe, eventually became corrupted and they were enculturated by the Greeks eventually.
Yeah. That is no impact on the story of Hanukkah, though, because physical people will always be good or bad. They'll always be better or worse. So in other words, the story of Hanukkah is a snapshot in history. Those people were the few against the many. They were being religious. They had persecution not to fulfill the laws of the Torah. They fought against that persecution and they won miraculously. So that we celebrate. If afterwards the same dynasty later did sins and were atrocious and were evil and were corrupt, that may be true. That's not relevant to the story of Hanukkah. It is relevant to us to study that part of history and understand what we can learn from it. But it has nothing to do. Well, I don't know if it has nothing to do, but largely unrelated to the
But
miracle of Hanukkah that we celebrate.
it's the lighting of the Chanukah that represents all the things that, in terms of return to Shuva, returning to the temple, the idea of it, the spirituality of it, and not a certain food. So we don't need the food. We have the menorah, and this is why the Chanukah in this case, and this is why. This is why if you actually just have a Chanukah lighting and sing some songs, and we celebrate that, and of course, if you want to eat something, fine. And we have that culture, and the Ashkenazis do. I don't know if the Sephardim do. I don't think so. But the idea is that that's what you need to focus on the why of that aspect. That's what carries you off for the next 2,200 years.
You are exactly right. So, but what you're pointing out is the timing, which you're actually right about, is the timing in history when the Hanukkah story took place. In other words, we're gonna cover this and explore this in a little bit of a greater detail right now. And it's exactly true that the story of Hanukkah is what carried us throughout the rest of the exile up until today for the next 2,000 years, that spiritual focus of Hanukkah, more than we had in the holidays before it. So first, in order to understand Hanukkah a little bit better, we're going to focus on Greek and Jewish wisdom, which was the background before and behind the story of Hanukkah, because Alexander the Great had conquered the land of Israel over 100 years before the story of Hanukkah, and the Greek culture was slowly becoming a part of the culture of the land of Israel over the course of this 100-year period before the story of Hanukkah, where it came to a forefront, and they finally said, you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z from the laws of the Torah. So in order to understand the Greek influence on the Jewish people at the time, we're going to analyze one aspect, which is an interesting angle, which the Rebbe presents, which is the translation of the Torah into Greek, the Septuagint. How does this relate to the story of Hanukkah, if at all? So first of all, is translating the Torah in general to Greek in specific, is that a good thing in general? Again, we're hyper-focusing on a detail to bring out something greater about the Greek influence on the Jewish people at the time, or you could call it secular wisdom, how it influenced Torah wisdom. So again, now very specifically on the point of translation. Was it a good thing that the Torah was translated into Greek? So we're going to introduce here on this page the story of the Septuagint from Torah sources. Actually, we're going to get to that later. On this page, we're going to talk in general about translating the Torah into Greek. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So maybe, Steve, are you available for a moment with the microphone? You available over there? All right.
I am.
So
for the moment.
Stuff.
How you doing?
That's okay. Every moment's good. If you want to read for us this first little box here from the Talmud Tractate Megillah 9b about translating the Torah into Greek.
Sure.
Okay.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that the books of the scripture are permitted to be written only in Greek. Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan further said, what is the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? Scripture says, God enlarged Japheth, and he shall dwell on the tents of Shem. This means that the words of Japheth shall be in the tents of Shem. But why not say the words of Gomer and Magog? Rabbi Hia ben Abba replied, the real reason is because it is written, let God enlarge Japheth, implying let the chief beauty, youth of Japheth, be in the tents of Shem.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Just to unpack this a little bit, in the list of the original people that populated the earth in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, we find 3 brothers that were sons of Noah. So Noah and his family were the only survivors of the flood. And he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In English, Japheth. Right here on this, Japheth, in this page over here, Japheth. So the Jewish people and others are descended from Shem. there are other people that are descended from Ham and from Yafes. So who's descended from Yafes? Amongst them are the Greeks. It lists amongst the sons of Yafes, it says Yavan, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Suval. There's a few people that are listed as being sons of Yafes. One of them is Yavan, which means Greece, country of Greece, Greek people, descendants of Yafes. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, the verse says, there in Bereshis, there in Genesis, it says that the Yafes will dwell in the tent of Shem. So in our tents of the Jewish people, we are going to have something from Yafes in our tent. So what is that? That is the Greek language. We are going to have the Greek language in our tents. The Torah can be translated only into Greek, according to Rabbi. Actually, the Torah can be written only in Greek, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So then the question was asked: what about the other sons of Yafes, which are Gomer and Magog? Why don't we mean them? Why only Greek? Why only the Greek language and not those other ones that are from the same family? So that's when Rabbi Chia bar Abba replied, and it was a play of words on Yafes. Yafes also means Yaf-Yuth, which means beauty. So the beauty of Yafes will be in the tents of Shem. What's beautiful? The Greek language. The Greek language is the most beautiful of all languages. So here we have another translation of the same piece of the Talmud. Maybe Steve, if you could read this one as well. Again, same piece of Talmud, the last piece just translated by another translator.
Rabbi Hiya bar Abba says, this is the reason, as it is written, God shall enlarge Yafet. Yafet is etymologically similar to the Hebrew term for beauty, Yofi. The verse teaches that the beauty of Yafet shall be in the tents of Shem, and Greek is the most beautiful of the languages of the descendants of Yafet.
Okay, thank you, sir.
A high priest.
That's the next part that we somehow got into our thingamajig. Okay, thank you so much for that. So we basically have a source here from the Talmud that Greek has an advantage over all other languages, besides for Hebrew, that if you're looking to write the Torah, you can write it only in Greek and not in other languages. That's in the Babylonian Talmud. What about the Jerusalem Talmud? We have that at the bottom of the page. Maybe Reb Shmuel, if you could read that for us, from the Jerusalem Talmud.
Jerusalem Talmud, Megillah 1.9. They searched and found that the Torah could not be translated according to all its needs except in Greek. I
so
just
they
don't
basically
understand. History doesn't tell us that. So
this is the sages of the Jerusalem Talmud who made the statement that they basically analyzed or researched all the different languages and that were extant at the time. And they concluded that the only one that could properly receive the Torah, that the Torah could be translated properly in that language, is the Greek language.
This
that
is
was
like
their
200 years or so before the Rome, right?
Well, this statement from the Jerusalem Talmud is actually later, but we're talking about also an earlier time period before Rome, right? Let's just sum up this page in short without getting too much into the details. On this page, we see something beautiful about the Greek language, that it's praiseworthy and you can actually translate the Torah into Greek, and it's considered a great thing. Fine. Very nice. What do we have on this next page over here? That the translation of the Torah into Greek is not a good thing. And we're going to try to understand discrepancy here. So this is from the tractate Sofrim. It's considered one of the minor tractates of the Talmud. And it's about the story of the first translation of the Torah that is still available to us today, which is the Septuagint, famous Septuagint, that the Torah was translated into Greek by Jewish elders. And by the way, who says that it was Jewish elders that translated the Septuagint? Both Jewish and non-Jewish sources both agree that it was Jewish elders that made this translation, which of course stands to reason, because who else would know what the Torah says? And they both agree that it was either 70 or 72 elders that translated the Torah. Now, is the exact wording that they have in the Septuagint today the same as then? Not necessarily. Maybe things have changed. but generally speaking, I guess that's where it's sourced from. So there's two accounts, even right here in the Jewish text. Let's read this inside. It's once happened that 5 elders wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy in Greek. King Ptolemy was the leader of Egypt under the Greek Empire at around 250 before the Common Era. So, and the 5 elders wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy in Greek, and that day was as ominous for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made, since the Torah could not be accurately translated. So we find here that there's something very, very bad and very negative about the fact that the Torah was translated into Greek. This is one account about 5 elders, and then the next paragraph is the more common account about the 72 elders, and this is in the same source. So it also happened that King Ptolemy assembled 72 elders and placed them in 72 separate rooms without telling them the reason for which he had assembled them. He went on to each one of them and said to him, "Write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your master." The omnipresent Hashem inspired them, and the mind of all of them was identical. So each on his own wrote the same translation of the Torah, introducing the same 13 alterations. So this is, we're not going to read the rest of it now, but this is a famous piece in the Talmud that all 72 elders who were placed in 72 different rooms translated the entire Torah exactly as each other, and all of them made 13 alterations. And one of them is here, which was on the bottom of our text. God created in the beginning instead of in the beginning God created. And that was because they didn't want people to make a mistake, that the word voracious in the beginning means a noun, and that noun created something, which is God. They didn't want people to make a mistake. All 72 elders made this one correction in the translation, that they put the word God first. God created in the beginning. And there's 12 other alterations that they made. But the main point that we want to bring out here today, that's a discussion for another time, but for today, we want to bring out that this is portrayed in a very, very negative light, this occurrence, that the Torah was translated into Greek at the behest of King Ptolemy. And this is not the only source where we find that it was portrayed in a negative light. There's another ancient Jewish text written 2,000 years ago, Megillas Tainus, the Scroll of Fasts, which was written before the Mishnah. It was written while the temple was still standing, and we still have this text today. And in that text, it says the list of important dates in Jewish history. It says on the 8th day of the Hebrew month of Tevet, which we're in now, is when the 72 elders translated the Torah into Greek. And for 3 days, darkness came to the world. That's what it says in this text. So definitely it's portrayed in a negative light that the Torah was translated into Greek. So the Rebbe's question is, how come we find such wonderful expressions about translating the Torah into Greek in one place in the Talmud, but in another place in the Talmud we find that translating Torah into Greek is a bad thing? So the answer he gives is very simple. Is if you translate the Torah, in other words, you make the Torah, which is written in Hebrew, accessible in another language, why are you doing that? If the reason you're doing that is because it was commanded by God, which we find in the Torah, earlier in the Torah itself, Moshe writes down the Torah translates it into all languages on a stone, and then they buried those stones in the Torah itself. If you're commanded by God to translate the Torah, it will only have a positive result. But if the reason you're translating it, if it was not commanded by God, then your translation may end up being misused. Someone who reads this translation might use it somehow for a purpose that is not in harmony with the original translation, with the original source, which is the divine wisdom of the Torah. And of course, by the Septuagint, the sages were not commanded by God. They were commissioned by a physical king. It happens to be they didn't have a choice. They were under duress. And Jewish law agrees that when you're under duress, this is a permissible activity. They weren't not allowed to translate. They were permitted to translate, but it wasn't a translation commissioned by God. It was commissioned by a physical king, and thus it was possible that something negative could come out of this translation. What does the Rebbe suggest came out of this translation? So the translation of the Septuagint by the sages commissioned by Ptolemy was exactly 100 years before the decrees on the Jewish people during the time of Chanukah, according to the history book called Seder Hadoros. There's a book written several hundred years ago called Seder Hadoros, written by Rabbi Yechiel Halperin. He lived in Germany, and he goes through the entire Jewish history from beginning to end meaning according to his time period, according to Jewish traditional sources. So from the beginning of the world until whenever it is, and he goes by year. He lists every important event that happened in a particular year throughout all of Jewish history. And amongst those dates, you find he has a year that he says when the Torah was translated into Greek by the sages. And then 100 years later, actually there it's 99, or maybe it's 100. So whatever it is, around 100 years later, you find that the first decrees against the Jewish people by the Greeks showed up 100 years after that translation. So the Rebbe suggests that there's a link between the two. The Rebbe suggests that had it not been for the fact that the Torah was translated into Greek, the Greeks never would have been able to make decrees against the Torah. Why is that the case? Because the Torah is divine wisdom. The Torah is the source of all world wisdoms. Any wisdom in the world is sourced and rooted in Torah. And thus, it's impossible for any other wisdom in the world to have any foothold or strength against the wisdom of the Torah. Yes, they could do like in the time of Purim, they could say, we don't appreciate the Jewish people, or the Jewish people, it bothers us personally, or that we're disturbed by them, so we want to annihilate them. But you can't challenge the wisdom of the Torah. It's impossible. What's the only way that the wisdom of the Torah can be challenged? Through this, that the Torah was translated, and it was studied over the course of 100 years. And then what were people able to do? So the Torah has two components to it. Torah, on the one hand, is divine. It comes from God. On the other hand, Torah is also a wisdom, and it's the deepest and most profound wisdom accessible to man, to humankind. So Torah has both of these elements. It's divine and it's a wisdom. So once the Torah was translated, it then became possible for the non-Jewish people at the time to study the Torah and to be inspired and to appreciate the beautiful wisdom that the Torah has. So that sounds like a beautiful thing, but the negative aspect of it was that they were then able to say, you know what, maybe the Torah isn't divine. Maybe it's just a beautiful wisdom. Maybe that's what the Torah is. It's wonderful. And from over the course of those 100 years, they were able to reach a point where they were able to tell the Jewish people, and I believe the Jewish people were under Greek rule throughout all of these 100 years. They were able to reach a point where they were able to say, declare our wisdom is better than your wisdom. You, Jewish people, shouldn't be keeping the elements of your Torah which are not logical, which are irrational, because our wisdom is more rational than your wisdom. Or your wisdom is very rational, but there's certain parts of it which are irrational. And those parts you shouldn't keep. That's what the Rebbe suggests. And we have here also in the text of the Al Hanisim, which is the prayer that we add on Chanukah, we find this sentiment. Maybe Rabbi Shmuel, if you'd like to read this little piece here.
In the days of Mattiyahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hezbonian, and his sons, when the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and violate the decrees of your will. But you, in your abounding mercies, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended its rights, and avenged the wrongs done to them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of Hashem.
Okay, it's cut off there, but thank you. So the main thing I wanted to bring out here was that the sentiment that the Greeks were coming to make the Jews forget, as Hasidic texts have pointed out many times, your Torah and the decrees of your will. So according to the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, in what he writes, that the Greek decrees against the Jewish people actually came in two stages. The first stage was that, if you're familiar with, there's three types of mitzvahs. There's chukim, edot, and mishpatim, which are statutes, testimonies, and civil laws. So the civil laws make sense to us. Even if the Torah hadn't been given, we would have thought of them ourselves. The testimonies like Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, etc., we understand them, but just because God told us, like God said, 6 days you shall work, on the seventh day you shall rest, because the world was created in 6 days and God rested on the seventh. So had God not told us about Shabbat, we wouldn't have done it, but once we're told about it, it makes sense to us. That's the middle level. The highest level is chukim, decrees that we still don't understand why, like the laws of purity and impurity, the laws of keeping kosher, and other such laws. So according to the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the first stage of the Greek decrees, step number one, was that they outlawed this first category of decrees. It said any mitzvah which is not understood at all, those are the mitzvahs which are now not to be kept. Purity and impurity, etc. And that's also why we find the focus on when the Greeks entered the temple, what did they do? They didn't just defile and break and burn down the whole temple. That wasn't their purpose. That wasn't their goal at all. They had a very narrow focus of what they wanted to accomplish. They defiled the pure oil that was sealed with the seal of the high priest to make it pure. So in order to light the menorah every day in the temple, they had to have pure oil. And it was sealed with the seal of the high priest. And the Greeks broke all of the seals. Why? Because it was a spiritual war. Their goal was to say the laws of purity and impurity are not right, they're irrational, and these are not something that should be kept. That was stage number one of the Greek decree. Stage two was they even moved on to some of the testimonies. They said Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, which is the new month, and circumcision should not be kept. So even those laws which are understood somewhat or understood fully, why you should do them, circumcision is also a sign of our connection to Hashem in our physical flesh. They're not civil laws, but we understand them. Some of those laws too became outlawed in the second stage of moving the Jewish people towards the enlightenment of Greek wisdom. So those were the two stages, and the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, also says something very interesting. And anyone else here who has studied any Greek philosophy can share with me what your thoughts are about this. I'm just going to tell you from my perspective, I haven't studied Greek philosophy intimately on its own, but I'm sharing here what's presented from Jewish sources. Obviously, I've heard of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and in school we studied some of the Greek city-states, and there's Greek mythology, and there's all sorts of Greek stuff. But I'm presenting to you here from a Jewish perspective, what was Greek philosophy as opposed to Jewish philosophy? What was the core difference between the Greek and the Jewish philosophy? So the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, articulates it as follows. He says the Greek wisdom believed in anything that could be understood by the intellect, which includes, or could include, it could include believing in God. It could include believing in the oneness of God. It could include believing that God is eternal. All of those things could be understood by the intellect alone, and the Greeks had no issue with that. The Greeks had no issue with belief in God, no issue with believing God as one, no issue with believing God as eternal. Those items were included within what the Greeks believed to be rational ideas. What part of the Torah was non-rational to the Greeks? What do the Greeks feel does not make any logical sense? Two main elements. Element number one is prophecy, and element number two is divine providence. And both of them have to do with the same thing, that God is not just infinite and beyond all of existence, but God hones in on the particular and speaks to one person or one group of people, or observes one person or one group of people. That did not make any logical sense to the Greeks. And all of the mitzvot of the Torah fall under this category because they're all in the realm of prophecy. They're all in the realm of God speaking to an individual group of people and telling them what they should do. That was all under the realm of what the Greeks believed was non-rational. So the Greeks were all about belief in God. God is one, God's eternal, God's infinite, God's beyond all of existence. All of those things fit into the rational framework of the Greeks because they believed that from an intellectual and rational perspective that could be true. But they did not believe in prophecy and divine providence, anything that where the infinite God focuses in on the particular person or group, including all of the mitzvot which were given to us by Moshe, by God at Mount Sinai. That whole thing did not, that piece of the Torah story didn't fit in rationally with their framework. And he says there also, the Tzemach Tzedek, that therefore, even if somebody would argue, wow, look, this or that thing happened to me by divine providence, like I did something and then something happened and I believe that it was God who caused this chain of events. He said the Greeks would listen to such a claim, but they would throw out such a claim with a very lousy excuse, which is fine, that they were entitled to do so. But why would they do that? Because it didn't fit into their natural intellectual framework. And thus, if any little detail didn't fit to them, that was enough of an excuse to throw it out, something like that. But at any rate, if anyone wants to chime in at this point, this is the distinction between Greek and Jewish wisdom as shared by the Tzemach Tzedek, the third of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Feel free to share your thoughts before we go further.
I would like to argue that since they had numerous, and I don't know how many different gods they worshiped, but they made great temples, as we know, great physical structures to celebrate, to worship one god or another. And so they were into a lot of gods, and their temples were so great, and they had statues and the rest of that stuff. They must have surely believed that if they prayed, I guess, to these idols, that they would in fact get something of great good from it. So they surely would have understood that, what it seems to me, and I don't know anything about Greek philosophy either, but the fact is that they had all these different gods that they worshiped. They probably just didn't think that only one God was the way to understanding.
Okay. So that's an important point. So I think we'll let's tie in that thought with a possible suggestion. It says about idol worshippers that in essence, idol worshippers also believed in one God, but they believed it's impossible to say that a single God in charge of all of existence would care about particular creations or would focus on particular creations. So therefore, what's the thesis of idol worshippers? What's the thesis of idol worshippers? That there's one infinite God who created all of existence, or which all of existence derives from. But then that one God gave over power to many individual forces in creation. And those individual forces now have the power to influence particular outcomes in particular realms. Like, for example, it could be the force of wind, the force of sun, the force of love, the force of growth, many different forces which the infinite God gave over power to. The infinite God is aloof and beyond and has no connection with the particulars of creation. But those individual powers now have the power to do anything. So that could be argued. The Greeks were rational, but not like they had a different rational framework than people today who might not believe in Greek mythology. Their rational framework is we observe forces in existence. We observe wind, we observe love, we observe fire, we observe all these things. They are forces. There must be these different forces that have some kind of power, and we want to worship them, and hopefully they'll give us something back. But they didn't believe in a one God that could focus in on one creation or one group of creations, such as the Torah suggests. That Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, there's one God, and that one God gave us all of the mitzvot and is also in charge of all of existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the whole pivotal idea that they just couldn't grasp the nature of one God, for one thing.
Right. Okay, so let's go. We have a little note here in the chat. The ancient Greeks revere the human form, a form of idolatry. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. I guess the idea would be, Dave, that if they would believe in one God that's beyond all existence, they would pay less attention to the human form. Or if they would believe that God was intimately connected with all details of existence, then they would recognize that every part of the human form, you shouldn't look at the human form. You should look at the God that created that human form. But okay, it's a good point, Dave, about they revere the human form. So let's go further. We're discussing now the problem of Chanukah, and now we're going to move on to the solution of Chanukah. So the problem of Chanukah was that there was this overpowering of Greek wisdom over the spiritual wisdom of the Torah. They were able to claim that our wisdom is superior to certain elements of your wisdom. There's certain elements of your wisdom that should be discarded, and those are any elements which suggest that there's a divinely inspired particular act that you should do, which God, the infinite God, commands you to do. So don't do circumcision, don't keep Shabbat, don't do all these things because they suggest that there's an infinite God who has told you to do these things. That part's irrational. But you know what you should keep from the Torah? You should keep honoring your father and mother, and you should keep not stealing, and you should keep not murdering, and you should keep all the interesting civil laws, the way the land is divided, and the laws of inheritance, and the laws of, there's many, many laws that you should keep in the Torah, but don't keep the ones that suggest a divine connection. Okay, that's a problem of Chanukah. What's the solution of Chanukah? How do you overpower this Greek wisdom? So we're going to share, let's go back. Let's 1 second. I'm going to go back here just a second to this slide here. So the solution to Chanukah in one word is oil. So let's just, highlight again, going back to the foods. So the foods used in the other holidays. On all other holidays, we have meals and we have kiddush. So what's part of the other holidays? Bread, water, meat, wine. These are foods that are associated with all of the other holidays. What's associated with Chanukah? Oil. Oil is the food item associated with Chanukah. We don't eat it though. Or to modify that better, we're not obligated to eat any foods on Chanukah. But there is a food item that we use. We light candles with it, and that's oil. Chanukah is all about a certain item called oil. And there are customs to eat foods that are made out of oil, but they're not an obligation, like latkes or sufganiyot. So what does oil have to do with the solution of Chanukah, with Torah wisdom regaining its foothold over Greek wisdom? So it happens to be like this, and this is going to be the main point of this discussion here, that in the wisdom of the Torah itself, there are multiple levels. There is the revealed part of the Torah, the body of Torah, and there's the hidden part of Torah, the soul of Torah. And even in the hidden part of Torah itself, there are multiple levels. There is the level of secrets, razin, and then there's the level of secrets, the most hidden level within Torah. What is the connection here with what we've been saying so far? So let's focus on some of these items that we've been speaking about. We said that over here, let's click on this. We said that many of the regular food items that Jewish people eat are compared to Torah. So we said that bread is compared to Torah. We brought from the Tanakh. We said that water is compared to Torah. So we also find that wine is compared to a part of Torah, and we also find that oil is compared to a part of Torah. So bread, water, wine, oil, all of these elements and meat also as well, are compared to parts of Torah. So which part of the Torah is bread and water compared to? Are bread and water compared to? Bread and water are compared to the revealed part of the Torah, to the body of Torah, the actual text of the Torah that we're familiar with. Why? The reason why is because bread and water are foods that are necessary for our existence. In order for us to survive physically, we need bread and water. Obviously, you can modify what we mean. You can have this kind of bread or that kind of bread, this kind of food, that kind of food. But overall, the bread is a basic food item, water is a basic liquid item. We need these items to survive. So, which part of the Torah do we need to survive spiritually? At a minimum, to survive, we need the revealed part of Torah, which is what? The actual observances of the Torah. So keep Shabbat, put on tefillin, celebrate Pesach, eat matzah on Pesach, blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. All of these observances are the body of Torah, the revealed part of Torah, the bread and water of Torah. They are the basic elements of survival within Torah, spiritual survival within Torah. We need these elements to survive. So that's the revealed part of Torah. What's the wine and the oil? Wine is the secrets of the Torah. And oil also refers to the secrets of the Torah. Why? Because in the physical analogy of physical food, what's wine? Wine is something which we do not need to survive. But why do we have it? To add extra joy. What about oil? We also don't need oil to survive. Why do we have it? It adds extra pleasure. When we add oil to our foods, it makes the food tastier and more rich and also more unhealthy. But that's besides the point. So the more oil you put in, the better it's going to taste. Obviously not too much. But if you limit the oil, it's not going to taste as good. So oil makes your food taste better. Wine adds extra joy. So wine and oil are things which add extra energy to your basic survival. Similarly, the secret and the hidden part of the Torah are not necessary to our basic spiritual survival. The basic spiritual survival, in other words, to fulfill all of the mitzvot, we just need the revealed part of the Torah. But the secrets of the Torah are there to add extra pleasure and extra joy. They're not a necessity, but they add extra energy, extra pleasure, extra joy. So let's just read for a moment a text here from Maimonides on this subject. So I'm going to share here. Stop share. And we're going to share screen. And we're going to, 1 second here. There we go. Okay. Share screen. Let's click on. There we go. Okay. We're going to share here a little text from Maimonides. And maybe, Steve, if you're still available, if you'd like to read for us a little bit over here, maybe Law 10 and Law 11. These are the first 4 chapters of the Rambam, Maimonides' most famous work, the Mishnah Torah. And the first 4 chapters in particular of the laws of the foundation of the Torah. And this is where Maimonides talks about the more mystical or more spiritual parts of the Torah. So Steve, are you available for a moment to read for us maybe this particular law number 10? If not, we can move on to someone else. Okay, let's move on to Reb Shmuel. Reb Shmuel, could you read for us law number 10?
All these concepts which we have explained in this context are like a drop in a bucket. They are deep matters. Nevertheless, their depth does not approach the depth of the subject matter of the first and second chapters. So what are the third and second chapters?
In other words, there's chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. So he's saying chapters 3 and 4 are extra deep. Sorry, chapters 3 and 4 are deep, but chapters 1 and 2 are even more deep. That's what Maimonides is saying about the 4 chapters that he just wrote. Mm-hmm. He's finishing them right now.
The explanation of all the subject matter in the 3rd and 4th chapters is referred to as, what was that said?
Ma'aseh Bereshit.
Bereshit, the work of creation. The sages of the early generations commanded that these matters should not be expounded upon in public. Rather, a single individual should be informed about them and taught them. So it's kind of a secret club.
Yes. I just want to explain what this is before we go further to Law 11. The two terms we're about to see come from the Mishnah. The Mishnah gives one term called Ma'aseh Bereshit and another term called Ma'aseh Merkava. What do they mean? Ma'aseh Bereshit means to explain the story of creation that's written in the Torah. Ma'aseh Merkava means to explain the story of the chariot described by the prophet Ezekiel. Both of those are considered to be lofty spiritual subjects. What's the difference between explaining Ma'aseh Merkava, which is the chariot of Ezekiel, a very mystical part of our Torah, and what's the difference between that and the subject matter of Ma'aseh Bereshit, which is the understanding more properly the story of creation? So he says like this: the subject matter of Ma'aseh Merkava, which is the chariot of Ezekiel, should never be expounded upon, even to a single individual, unless he is wise and capable of understanding, in which instance he is given fundamental points. You can teach him a little bit of it. In contrast, the subject matter of Ma'aseh Bereshit, which is about the work of creation, may be taught to any individual, even though he is incapable of comprehending it with his own powers of understanding alone. He may be informed about everything that he could possibly know about these matters. Why are they not taught publicly? In other words, neither of these two subjects are taught publicly. Why not? Because not every person has the vast knowledge necessary to grasp the interpretation and the explanation of these matters in a complete manner. So again, this is Maimonides about the hidden part of the Torah. The hidden part of the Torah has two components. Number one, Ma'aseh Bereshit. Number two, Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of creation, or the story, the chariot of Ezekiel. And there's a difference between the two that's described already in the Mishnah. Both of them are not taught publicly. One of them is taught to one person, anyone. One of them is not even taught to one person, unless it's someone who's truly wise and capable of understanding. So that's just a description of the hidden part of the Torah, and you can see why it's hidden from this part of Maimonides. It's not publicly revealed. It's only taught to individuals. So let's move further down on this page. Law number 12. I'm just going to read a little bit here. And my apologies if we're going past the 9 o'clock time. Feel free to sign off if it's not working. If it's too late for your schedule, we'll just try to wrap it up a little bit and finish up the class in the coming few minutes. Law number 12. When a person meditates on these matters and recognizes all of the creations, the angels, the spheres, man, and the like, and appreciates the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, in all of these creations, he will add to his love for God. His soul will thirst, and his flesh will long with love for God, blessed be He. He will stand in awe and fear from his humble, lowly, and base natural nature. When he compares himself to one of the great and holy bodies, how much more so when comparing himself to the pure forms, which are separate from matter and do not share any connection with it. He will see himself as a vessel full of embarrassment and shame, empty alike. This is the last law of this chapter. The matters discussed in these 4 chapters concerning these 5 mitzvot, which is loving God, fearing God, knowing God's oneness, and there's a 5th one. The matters discussed in these 4 chapters are what the sages of the early generations term the pardes, which is the orchard. As they related, 4 entered the orchard, the pardes, and there's a whole story there in the Talmud about what that means. Even though they were great men of Israel and great sages, not all of them had the potential to know and comprehend all these matters in their totality. You know what? I am going to explain what that means. The Talmud says 4 men entered the pardes, which means they entered into the wisdom of the hidden part of the Torah. It says one of them died, one of them went crazy, the 3rd one I forgot what happened, but the 4th one, only Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and left in peace. So Maimonides is unpacking for us how come 3 of the greatest sages of the Jewish people entered into trying to understand the mystical part of the Torah and didn't succeed, and on the contrary, it ruined them or damaged them in some way. So he says, not all of them had the potential to know all these matters in their totality. So now Maimonides explains to us his thesis of how you're supposed to approach the hidden matters of Torah. I maintain that it is not proper for a person to stroll in the paradise, stroll in the orchard. Let's see in the chat. We've got something in the chat. Good night, everyone. Okay, good night, Dave. I maintain that it is not proper for a person to stroll in the paradise unless he has filled his belly with bread and meat. Bread and meat refer to the knowledge of what is permitted and what is forbidden, and similar matters concerning other mitzvot, even though the sages have referred to these as a small matter. For our sages have said a great matter, Meiser Merkava, a small matter, the debates of Abai and Rava. Nevertheless, it is fitting for them to be given precedence because they settle a person's mind. So I just want to explain what we said here in this paragraph, that Maimonides says you should first learn the entire revealed part of the Torah before you study the hidden part of the Torah. The revealed part of the Torah he compares to bread and meat. In other words, elements which are more basic to our survival. And the hidden part of the Torah is like what we said, is like wine and oil. So I'm going to finish reading Maimonides. Now we're finished with reading Maimonides. I want to return to our question with which we began this class. The question was, how come on Chanukah we do not eat any physical foods such as water? We're not obligated to eat any physical foods such as water, bread, meat, or wine. But we're not obligated to do anything with that. We are obligated to give thanksgiving and to light candles with oil. So what's the distinction between those four elements of bread, water, wine, and meat and oil? What's the difference between them? So the Rebbe says like this, and this is going to be the solution to Chanukah. The wine refers to bread, water, and meat is the revealed part of Torah. Wine is the hidden part of Torah, but only the regular secrets of Torah, like the lower level of secrets, the level of secrets which we don't eat every day. It's not like water, it's not like bread. It's more like wine. We have it from time to time to add extra joy. That's what the level of wine in Torah represents. Hidden, but it's a lower level of hidden. It's a lower level of secret. What's oil, on the other hand? Oil refers to the deepest secrets of the Torah. And oil is something that we never eat or drink by itself because it's harmful to us to eat or drink it by itself. All we do is we mix drops into other foods. So similarly, the deepest secrets of the Torah we don't consume on their own. We mix them with other parts of the Torah. So that's what happens, says the Rebbe, by the story of Chanukah. In order to overpower the Greek wisdom, which was that everything has to be rational and everything has to make sense, and they looked at the Torah and said, this is a beautiful, rational work. There's certain elements which you shouldn't focus on, but the rest of it's very good. In order to overpower that and overcome that and re-emphasize the spirituality inherent in Torah, the Jews needed to connect with the oil of Torah, which is to connect, to take those deepest secrets of the Torah, the oil, and mix it with the other foods of the Torah, to demonstrate how each part of the Torah is really inherently spiritual. That's what the Jewish people needed to do in the time of Chanukah. So again, the key lesson here is that when we wish to study the Torah, and when we wish to appreciate how it's not only a rational wisdom, it's not only a bottom to top wisdom, it's not only a wisdom that comes from people who are presenting theories and trying to understand things to the best of their ability, but are ultimately flawed. It's really an above to below wisdom. It's divine. It comes from God, who is inherently familiar with all of existence. So when we want to study the Torah and to appreciate how it's not just an earthly wisdom, but it's a divine wisdom, the solution to the ability and the solution to doing that when confronted with typical rational wisdom is that it's necessary to connect with the secrets of the Torah, specifically through connecting to the secrets of the Torah, which are more spiritual and more mystical, and understanding the spiritual underpinnings and spirit behind all the mitzvot. That is how we emphasize and understand and appreciate how everything is divine and remain connected and rooted to the divineness of the Torah. So that is a general idea. Hope that was clear or inspirational or helpful. Please share any thoughts before we sign off. And of course, it's the last night of Chanukah. So if you haven't lit the menorah yet, it's 9:10 p.m., but feel free to light it now. And any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, this is why I probably would have never been a good yeshiva student because I'm not a deep thinker.
All right, let's hear it.
I would have never come to that conclusion.
We won't accept that, but let's hear it. Go ahead.
The thing is that when it was I'm thinking now that it was not more than, I don't know, 30 years ago, let's say, that all of a sudden Chabad started putting Chanukah on fronts of their properties, on the corner somewhere in public property when they could get it. And all of by saying, and this is in your lifetime, certainly, and certainly was in mine, where all of a sudden the Chabad was bold enough to do that when the Jews were never supposed to do that. Oh my goodness, they had the Christmas tree lightings, and that was the Christians did that. But the Chabad should never, ever, Jews should never, ever put a Chanukah out in a public place where people would see that the Jews are still here. And this is what we did. And this is important. This isn't Jingle Bells. It's not Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It's not Santa Claus. It's really the essence of the lights represent the survival of Torah and the survival of the Jews to the public. This is why we put the menorah out onto our windows. This is why the menorah is the light into the world so that people know what Torah is to the world. This is why it was okay to put it into Greek, because Greek was a language that sophisticated people could read. But let me point out also that Joshua, when he crosses over, the first thing he's told to do is to make a wonderful, smooth surface for rock with boulders or something and write the Torah in 76 languages. Right?
Correct.
Yeah. So already this is foretelling that this is the Torah for the world. And the Greek was the first language. I don't know anything about the totality of that, but basically the first people who are able to write down in something other than Sanskrit and on stones and all the rest of that stuff. And and this is what intellectuals understood and read, and presumably from the Romans who cared finally got onto it. This is why you finally got the Christianity, and I don't get all that. But the point is that. And when Torah was first translated and written in the Gutenberg Bible, as it were, that was the what the Christians call the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Torah. That was written in Latin, because that was the written language of the sophisticated people of the time, of the kind of intellectuals, and guess what? And that resulted in the spread of religion, certainly whatever Jews could make of it, to what became the Christians, to the whole Western world, not the Asian world, but the Western world. So, and Hanukkah to me, aside from the frivolous stuff of any kind of thing, that it shows that the world, that we are still here, that the Torah is here, that God is here. And this is our representation of it. Very, very important. I think
you nailed it. I think you nailed the point that the Rebbe was trying to bring out. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, when Chabad did this, it wasn't that long ago. It was I'm just talking maybe 30 years ago that they started doing this.
And, I think you really nailed it, because that's exactly it. Why would a person be reluctant to share the wisdom of the Torah or a Torah observance publicly? Because there could be a fear that the contemporary wisdom is more valid than the Torah's wisdom.
Which is exactly what the Greeks were trying to tell the Jews.
And, that's exactly what the Greeks were trying to. Well, this is not an indictment of anyone in particular. This is not to judge anyone. This is just a natural experience which a person might have, which is there's a modern world, there's a contemporary world, there's a contemporary understanding of things. We love our tradition, but it's kind of uncomfortable to put it out there publicly, because how does it kind of compare to or how does it relate to the contemporary understanding that exists out there? And I think what you're saying is correct, that the fact that public and menorah lightings, and the Chabad has been putting up the menorahs in public places, is rooted in that it's specifically through the hidden part of the Torah, the secrets of the secrets, when you're able to blend that in to study that and incorporate that, then you're able to sense the divine in every part of the Torah, and that in other words, that you still feel in truth how this is a divine wisdom. This supersedes any other understanding that exists out there.
Yeah. And the thing is, when I was coming up, now we weren't in a religious family, I was in a secular family, but the people that the Jewish families that I knew who lit a little menorah for their children primarily, and for a very brief time, I did it myself until I was discouraged. That's another story. But the thing is that people did not, in my neighborhood, as it were, the people that I knew did not put it on the window at all. They put it somewhere, and they didn't want to show that the rest of the world that they were lighting a menorah. And and so this sort of thing has changed. And we're already talking about a time when Chabad started doing this. I wish I knew the exact date when they started. Somebody had the bright idea to do this, but it couldn't have been more than 30 years ago. I don't know. And which was only some 40 years when after the end of the Holocaust, when all the Jews were supposed to disappear.
Right.
So this is very contemporary. This is
Absolutely.
this is like new. It's like a rebirth. This is what Chabad was going to do. This is what caught me many years ago. So that's my story. But
all right.
I put a Chanukah out on my lawn now for several years, and don't make a big deal of it.
Right.
But it's out there, and
All right. All right. Very, very well said. Okay. Well, happy Hanukkah. Thanks for joining in.
Yeah.
And that's wishing everyone who might be watching this. We're still on Facebook Live. A happy Hanukkah. If you didn't light a menorah yet, feel free to pull out a menorah and light one. If you don't have one, head over to Main Street and Laurel. We'll hook you up. And otherwise, happy Hanukkah. Let's spread the light of Hanukkah even after Hanukkah, and may we merit speedily the coming of Mashiach. Have a great night.
Absolutely. I'll be in contact.
All right.
All right. We have